Welcome then to those who can hear me. Good afternoon here in Geneva, and welcome to the WTO series of webinars on the governance of data flows and trade. This particular webinar focuses on the trade implications of cybersecurity risks and policies. Now, cybersecurity, which we understand here as the security of digital communication infrastructure and services that enable the integrity, availability, and traceability of data, has become increasingly important for international trade, as you're no doubt aware. The number of individuals, companies, and governments operating online and communicating through the internet increases steadily, and recent numbers show that more than half of the world's population is currently online. As a wide range of economic sectors, including critical industries, such as food or energy, now rely on connected ICT goods and services, that means, of course, that the information component of trade, both in goods and services, becomes an integral part of trade itself. That means, of course, at the same time that the number of cyber incidents, and we're consciously taking a broad terminology here, such as attacks or breaches on the integrity of data, is also increasing, and their impact is much more devastating than before, as these infrastructures are quite widespreadly relying on digital networks. These activities undermine the online trust that is needed to support the growth of trade in the digital economy, and thus the security of the relevant data depends on cybersecurity measures taken by companies and governments. Now, in this webinar, the discussion focuses on all types of data more generally, and personal data, or a specific webinar on personal data, will be held next month. But the current discussion, of course, includes that type of data too. The webinar is spread out over 2 days, today and tomorrow, and in total we'll be covering 4 themes. Today, we're going to explore the trade implications of cybersecurity risks and national policies. And we'll then take a closer look at ICT product regulation and standards development, discuss international regulatory cooperation in this area to foster interoperability. Tomorrow, the webinar will discuss trade implications of bilateral and regional approaches to cybersecurity, and also in a 4th theme on the cross-border exchange of information for law enforcement or regulatory oversight purposes. Now, please note that these webinars are recorded. The recordings and the presentation of the speakers will be made available on the WTO webpage on Trade Dialogues, which I understand the link to which Kian will be posting into the chat, or may already have done that. Now, please use the chat function to ask questions at any time, some of which may be taken up during the webinar. We've also received some questions ahead of the webinar, which we'll try and address. So please don't wait until the end to submit your questions. It's, of course, an informal setting, so any questions and interventions you make will not be considered to represent any official view of a position or your government that you might be affiliated with. So let's start. I would like to organize today's seminar in 3 questions, essentially, that I will ask to our eminent panelists. I would like to start with a quick round on what cybersecurity risks are, and this may be a sort of introductory part, what they are and what their trade implications are. In a second round, we'll then move on to what cybersecurity policies have been introduced, and what their implications for trade might be. This will be, I think, the center piece of this webinar. And we will then, in the last section, focus on ICT regulation and international regulatory cooperation in these regards regarding interoperability and standard setting in this area. Now, to address these questions, I am fortunate to have a number of eminent panelists on this panel. I'll start just in no particular order. We have Mr. Patricio Quesada Andur, who is from the Computer Security Incident Response Team of Chile. We have Ms. Heidi Lund, who is a senior advisor to the Swedish National Board of Trade that has worked on this particular question of cybersecurity quite extensively. We then have from the private sector, Mr. Zain Cleophas, who is the CEO and co-founder of Aretha Holdings. That is a company working in security, including cybersecurity in various sectors, and who's been involved in the South African cybersecurity policy developments. Also from the private sector, we have Andri Root, who's the head of IT operations of CommerceGate, which is a private company offering payment solutions and to merchants and webmasters across, well, the world and the internet, I would imagine. And then we have Ms. Grace Akoyo and Caroline Troin, who are both cybersecurity research analysts from the ITU that will be able to speak to the extensive research that the ITU has been doing in this field. So I'm very glad I have these colleagues to help me address the questions that I've already mentioned. So I'll start with the first one, the purpose of which is, of course, to explain to us and our participants what cybersecurity risks are and what their trade implications are in particular. And I'd like to start with a sort of more general overview, and then I'll turn to our representatives from the private sector to maybe give a particular flavor from their particular industries, and then finally turn to the ITU to see their more bird's eye view of this question. So I'm hoping to start with Heidi. Heidi, would you like to unmute yourself and tell us what cybersecurity, what cyber risks are from the perspective of the Swedish Board of Trade and what their trade implications are? Over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon from Stockholm. And my task today will be really to highlight the challenge of regulating IT security in ICT, and pretty much demonstrating that cyber regulation risks to create trade barriers, as cybersecurity requirements are not easily harmonized between different countries and markets. And let's see if do you see my screen here?
We do.
You do?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. If we go back into the 80s or 90s, we were still quite much focused on physical measures to secure valuable information, like clean desk policies and management systems. But today, as you know, there are a multitude of threats that are used to alter, steal, destroy our valuable information assets. Why we really need actually to address security in IT itself, which means everything from USB, software, hardware, printers, smart cards, and whole IT infrastructures where these commercial products are used. One way to address it is by public regulatory measures, but this is not easy, which is also reflected by the work of WTO. And the National Board of Trade, as a consequence, started to make an analysis on the subject, as we saw already many years ago, that technical barriers to trade that dealt with cybersecurity were addressed in the WTO Committee for Technical Barriers to Trade. And those regulatory measures that were addressed introduced by some WTO members were also such that were problems for Swedish companies who contacted us for help. As the analysis that we carried out proceed, it became really evident for me that it's not the legitimacy of the requirements that were introduced by some WTO members that were most interesting, but the difficulty to regulate IT security in general. But creating effective policies and legislative initiatives are weakened by some factors. One, I would say, is a false belief in the system. By this I mean that it's easy to think that somebody else takes care of IT security. It can be the husband with the firewall, it could be the IT guy at the office, or the government. We hope that take care of it. And why do I really stress this factor? Well, there is also a risk that policymakers and regulators will hand over these technical and complicated issues to a clique of experts. And this can, of course, in a worst case, result in a regulation that favors some countries more than others, or in regulatory solutions that are costly for society but ineffective for the purpose. And another takeaway I would give to you is also that, which came actually as a shock for me, is that many countries and their security authorities have totally different views on how ICT, cybersecurity in ICT should be regulated and how open authorities should be with the contents of the regulatory measures. And this naturally constitutes a big challenge if the aim is to harmonize these requirements worldwide. I hope to come back soon with some examples on how cybersecurity can be regulated and the pros and cons of this, but I think I stop here my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Yes, you've already forged ahead now in the regulatory, sort of in the second question, the regulatory response and the issues associated with that. I was hoping we would still educate our participants and ourselves in what the risks are exactly we're talking about and what their relation is to trade. Let me turn next to Zane, Claire first, to maybe give us a more practical view, still focusing on describing the risks that are posed by cyber incidents and a view on how they are related to cross-border exchange.
Thanks, Wolf. Well, just to add on to what Heidi said, you know, I think a classic example is you know, people's view that cybersecurity is cybersecurity is normally compartmentalized within the government instead of within the governments, and your biggest threat, essentially, with regards to cybersecurity, is the one thinking the other one is taken care of. You know, so there's what is found, there's a lot of silo approaches first and foremost. So you'll get practically, like in South Africa, our Department of Communications recently in the last 2 years merged, where telecommunications, postal services and data communications has merged into one. The problem, however, is you'll find our state security agency in the South African context is the drafter or you know, the main coordinator, the main player with regards to cybersecurity, you know, and the response thereof. The problem is this has a direct impact on who responds on what, first and foremost, and also, you know, you have a beautiful policy and everybody looks at each other as soon as there is an incident. Classic example yet again, we look at the whole global pandemic that is essentially the cause for us having this webinar and not meeting face to face, for instance. And surely you must have seen the rise of cybersecurity incidents and threats, you know, and these risks has been highlighted before, and now suddenly there is this huge escalation and everybody is looking at each other to say, but who was responsible, who is responsible, and how do we act on these things? So that is one part of it. Second part of it is obviously we'll be dealing with it a lot more in depth tomorrow, but the practical example is, you know, everybody doesn't share information. There's always accountability cross-border, whereas an incident nationally could be reported, but there is no coherent international law that says country X would cooperate with country Y in order to report certain incidents. I know when I was co-chairing the ITU's, you know, cooperation on IT security, on IT cybersecurity. You know, we forged relationships with many countries that are signatories to this in order for us to share information. The problem, however, is again, you can make all the papers in the world. From a practical perspective, if this is not implemented at country level, you do have a challenge when it comes to cyber risks that essentially becomes a cyber threat. In recent days, we don't even have to argue whether there is a cyber threat versus a cyber war, because when you start talking energy grids, you start talking national data, personal data, and privacy laws being this puts into perspective a very real situation of cyber warfare being very active. And warfare has always also been traditionally, coupled to defense forces, intelligence services, etc., which is no longer the case. It's everybody's business.
Okay, thank you, Zain. You were trailing off there, your sound towards the end. So if you could move closer to the microphone in your next intervention, that would be good. Thanks a lot. I will now turn to Andrew Rood. What can you tell us about the impact of cyber incidents, the risks that it has for your business, particularly, or more generally in the financial sector, and how does it specifically affect the cross-border dimension of your business?
Thank you very much, Wolf. One moment, please. I'm starting to share my screen.
Go ahead.
Yeah. One moment. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it. Excellent.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity to attend this panel. Few words about ourselves. As Wolf mentioned on the introduction part, we are a Spanish-based company regulated by Bank of Spain, payment institution, facilitating online merchants to receive payments from their end users around Europe and around the world. Let's start about what is cybercrime. Cybercrime normally is defined as any crime that is committed with the use of the computer. This could mean an email scam. It can be directed attack against the company's infrastructure. Cybercrime can also be sale of illegal materials over the internet. This, as we see, this poses quite wide range of cybercrime definition. Let's talk about the most common cybersecurity threats which we as a company face with in our day-to-day operations. You can see them in front of you. First of all, this is malware. Malware means program which is installed on the end user's desktop or mobile phone without intention of this person. What consequences could be of this installation? It depends on the intentions of this particular hackers group or attacker who did this attack. Web-based attacks and web applications attacks normally occurs when anyone browse internet using their internet browsers, and internet browsers use some APIs to communicate between web applications, and they might be vulnerable. Also, there are some other attacks such as man in the middle. So all these pose another group of cybersecurity threats. Next cybersecurity threat is phishing. Phishing is when attacker can try to, how to say, pretend not, not the person which they are, and try to make people who is subject of the attack to do some actions to the benefit of the attacker. Another widespread of security threat is denial of service. Normally, we all know about know and hear about distributed denial of service attacks, when attackers using the previously created botnets can dedicate all these botnets power just to get down some particular dedicated server in order to benefit for the attackers of the group who ordered this malicious act. And also, as we see, these DDoS attacks can happen either in commercial part, I mean, just to, how to say, get you down and bring some benefits to your competitors, or even in political view. For example, there were cases when some candidates had live questions, live panels, and they was attacked by this denial of service. Social engineering, another one security threat, which is, how to say, try to benefit from the all information publicly available over the internet, and which is normally posted by people themselves. So all information on the LinkedIn, on the social networks, all the check-ins, etc., 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 this can be used in wrong way and do harm to this information owner. Insider threat, this normally threat when someone inside the company, either deliberately or not, can facilitate for the external attacker to do their malicious actions. Information leakage, this is normally occurs when people are not very enough, sophisticated or qualified to do some actions, or, for example, they forgot to apply some rules or leave some unsecured ports without authorization, and everyone from the internet can get access to the internal company data, extract them, and benefit from it. Identity theft, this means that when someone can steal your identity, get your information, and try to pretend to be you when ordering some services or goods over the internet. Cryptojacking, this is relatively new, at least to the in comparison to previous types of attacks. This means that when a computer is being infected, or even smartphone is being infected by a virus or malicious program, its power, its computing power is being used for mining some bitcoins, which are Bitcoin or Monero, and those benefit to the attacker. Ransomware was very popular and posed very huge risk for companies up to 2016, but now it's getting down in overall industry over the world. But nevertheless, we need to pay attention to it, and it means that attackers get control over your computer and encrypt your data and propose it you to buy it back for some particular amount of bitcoins. Normally it's cryptocurrency, in order to make harder investigation should it happen. And data breaches, it's not how to say cybersecurity threat itself, but it's when it comes to threats in the cyber landscape, data breach is the only topic that does not specifically apply to a threat, but reflects successful malicious attempt, which led to an incident from the compromise or loss of data. So this is biggest cybersecurity threat which we face it on a daily basis. this is all what I wanted to share at this stage.
Thank you, Andrei. Would you be able to say which one of those threads? And thank you for this comprehensive overview of this more technical.
I will describe it at the later stages.
Okay, we're still trying to focus on the sort of which of these risks has a particular impact on trade, other than obviously the general impact on the cost of doing business more generally. Let me now turn to our colleagues from the ITU to maybe share with us what their research can tell us about the cybersecurity risks and their trade relatedness and their trade impact more generally, so that we get a better handle on whether there are risks that are more trade related than others.
Thank you, Wolf, and thank you to the WTO for having us for this. My name is Caroline Troen, and I'm here with my colleague.
My name is Grace Achayo, and Caroline and I work with the Cybersecurity Division at ITU. Back to you, Caroline.
So we'll zoom past what is the ITU and just go straight to trade implications. We've had our other panelists outline some of the key types of cyber threats that are faced. We know that there are an increase in cyber threats, especially now with COVID. We've seen a huge onslaught of phishing and malicious activity that targets activities around this virus. But why does cybersecurity matter for global trade? At its heart, trade is enabled by interoperability and trust. And that matters for when you're doing your online payments, when we're talking about the data flows across borders, when we're talking about cyber espionage and corporate espionage, when we're talking about the protection against it, we're talking about supply chain security. And obviously there are a lot of externalities we can talk about in this process, but it matters. It fundamentally matters across the entire global trade system. Here at the ITU, Grace and I work on the Global Cybersecurity Index, which is a composite index measuring a range of different factors related to cybersecurity commitments. Here you can see the 5 pillars that we look at. And since we have an audience here who has a bit of a training in indices and looking at trade data, I wanted to compare it to some indices you might be more familiar with. So the first is the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index. And what I find really interesting here is there is no straight relationship. Just because you score well on the Global Competitiveness Index doesn't mean that your cybersecurity is exceptional. In fact, perhaps even being a more competitive country might make you more attractive as a cyber target, because of the aspects that make you attractive for trade might also make you vulnerable. Likewise, if you compare this to the World Bank's Doing Business scores, which I know have been a lot in the news last month, no direct correlation. And the interesting thing here is not trying to find the correlation, but finding why some countries differ so much. So Wolf, that's just a very high level, and we'll turn it back to you for the next section.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is excellent. So I think we have laid out a little bit what is the lay of the land of the risks we're talking about. The chat is already teeming with questions on how trade related all these issues really are. But I think the last intervention, I think, illustrated quite well, which is also the result of a number of work in this area, of colleagues of ours of work in this area, that highlights that in the age of global value chains, in particular digital global value chains, of course, the elements and risks that affect the digital infrastructure are of a disproportionate relevance to the trade that uses disproportionately this digital infrastructure for communication. There is a fair amount of work about as I mentioned in the introduction, the information component, even in traditional trade, is growing very quickly, and even normal goods or services trade mode 1 it would almost be impossible these days if there wasn't the accompanying information and a reliable and secure infrastructure that could actually transport that information that accompanies that, that information component. But let's now turn to what we've already kind of breached here and there, the question of policies. Now, of course, here, as always, when you come to regulation, the trade perspective on this is, of course, what are the trade impacts of these regulations, including what are the trade impacts of different regulation in different trading partners, and what long-term or short-term effects can this have. Now here, I think I would, again, first turn to Heidi, if that's okay, to talk about the design and the considerations that go into formulating cybersecurity policies. And we will do around in a similar fashion as we have done now among the participants. And I think then we'll stop for a Q&A session among panelists to get us going. So Heidi, if you would like to take the floor, please.
So much again. I started by telling you about the importance in looking into cyber regulation of ITC due to that these requirement risk trade barriers. And now I would like to move into explaining how actually cybersecurity and ICT can be addressed by regulation and what this means for policy making. And there are, of course, several areas where regulation comes in. But as the National Board of Trade has carried out a study based on trade policy and those barriers we see on the trade policy arena, we have much focus on technical regulation, which means product requirements and also how IT products should be controlled or certified before putting them on the market. And the motivation was, of course, that this kind of product regulation is really an important way to address IT security, but also that such regulatory measures have actually manifested in barriers between countries. The next question is then, to what extent is there product regulation on IT security? If we look back, let's say 10, 15 years back, those authorities mainly prepared regulation on a very small area, I mean, atop of this pyramid, on communication security and products within the national defense. But due to that vulnerabilities increase in society, the security authorities have noted risk with commercial ICT products, and this results in many new regulatory initiatives. Or we could say that regulation hits more and more products than before. Another way to see it also that more and more ICT products are seen as a part of critical infrastructure, that infrastructure that should protect our society in health or energy, etc. But let's go back to the slide with the different requirement levels, because I would like to comment them shortly so that you get an understanding what this actually means. One way to regulate cybersecurity in ICT is to prepare mandatory requirements on the properties of ICT products themselves. Fortunately, such requirements are quite rare. And why do I say fortunately? Well, such requirements, of course, risk very quickly to become obsolete due to technological development. The most common scenario is actually that authorities prepare regulation on how a product should be controlled or certified. Well, is this good or bad? Well, a certification, a cyber certification is really good for identifying vulnerabilities in a product. But what is really important, and I hope that I get your attention now, a cyber certification will not make a product secure. And this is quite different from actually if you are talking about certifying a machinery or personal protective equipment. And why is this the fact? Well, the risk of an IT product is related to the environment where it's used. In addition, cyber certification is really complex, time-consuming, and extremely expensive. One's product certification costs from $50,000 and more. And this results in a situation when the number of certification is very low in relationship to the number of IT products and product development processes that probably should be certified in order to make the society safe. And this is why many countries are looking into solutions where you set requirements on the infrastructure, the platforms that are used to send information, for example, between security authorities, and where commercial IT products are used. And this doesn't make, of course, product certification unnecessary, but focusing on infrastructure, you take into account the vulnerabilities in ICT products from the very beginning. Otherwise, maybe you should need to ban the product as an authority. But we are talking about IT security. Shouldn't there really be some international requirements and international standards? Well, of course, international regulatory cooperation in this field is not non-existent. There are international standards for cybersecurity certification, and there are even mutual recognition for cybersecurity certificates between different countries. But it should be highlighted that not all countries are part of these different kinds of arrangements. Not all European member states are part of the European arrangement, and not all countries worldwide are part of those international arrangements. Furthermore, the international standard that's pretty much used for cyber certification, it's so generic that many countries feel that they wish to add own requirements on the top of these standards and to address security. And as these national requirements are hidden, regulatory fragmentation continues being a problem. But I could say that decision makers have, however, understood the importance of IT security and also seen that there is a regulatory fragmentation. And this we can see in Europe, but also worldwide in different kinds of regulatory initiatives taken to address. In Europe, there is a work on the cyber certification scheme, for example. And I would like to stress that the most important in these initiatives, many of them still under development, is that any regulatory strategies that you take, whether national or regional, it's the most important that they really are compatible with the global regulatory schemes. And also that whatever regulatory initiatives you take, that they are actually effective and deliver security, that there has been an analysis of the consequences of the regulatory proposals. As many of the regulatory alternatives that we have today, for example, certification, are so extremely expensive. If I have some minutes more, I would also like to address what kind of scenarios do we have today? What choices do regulators have in taking into account the international harmonization, and what does this all mean? Well, I could say that there are three main scenarios. The first scenario, you do absolutely nothing. Everybody, different countries regulate as they please, and companies need to adapt to different markets. This is a huge business for cybersecurity business, and it will be mainly the big companies who survive on these markets. Maybe nobody questions the regulations, the hidden regulations, but the cost will definitely be reflected in the product price without that we actually know what we are paying for, as these requirements are not transparent. It would also be very worrying if authorities regulate on national security level just in case. Due to that different countries make their own solution, it can actually make the ICT products less safe in comparison if many countries would cooperate on best practices as we do on standardization. So doing nothing has effects both on security and trade. And the second option is to focus on certification requirements, and that is pretty much where we are working very much at the moment. Many stakeholders require certification, but the question is really, can this cover all the products on the market, as certification is expensive and time consuming? And also, as I said, it doesn't guarantee security. So many are also quite doubtful of harmonizing certification requirements. But as I said, if you do it, you should take into account the global scope. And the third alternative deals with the infrastructure requirements, and it actually means to create a solution on national level to the security authorities. It creates structure for improvement of IT security without creating barriers to trade, and product requirements on certifications would then be based on international standards. And based on different expert opinions that I have got, they much lie on the third alternative. But again, this requires actions on the national, let's say, base rather than on international solution. So this is all bit problematic. So as you see now, cybersecurity is much a policy challenge, and the security part cannot work alone, but there is a need to discuss between trade policy professionals and security authorities. I think I stop here.
Thank you, Heidi. This is a good setting of the scene with the different elements of control and certification of products, moving up to infrastructure requirements in order to react to the fast changing situation, and to also look at the efficiency of the control system in order to make this a workable policy. Let me now turn to Patricio, who is actually working in an institution that actually is based on a national policy and administers these policies, who will be able to give us quite a concrete view on how these policies were developed in the particular situation of Chile and what their trade implications are. Over to you, Patricio.
Thank you. Good morning from Chile. I'm gonna share the screen now to show you presentation. See? Did you see?
Yes, we can now.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. I'm sorry. I went to the last page.
No problem. Try again.
Yeah. Give me a second. Oh, I'll show you everything. Well, I'm gonna talking about the national cybersecurity policy in Chile, but before that start with that, I want to say something very important that Caroline said that before. The supply chain security is a very important point for in the risk area and trade. I think I work in a daily basis with the experts and analysts, and as a country that supply many products for the rest of the world, I think it's important to put attention in what the regulators said in a world that is become more and more automatic now, and with the industry 4.0, and we need to put attention in that kind of risk in the case of the rest of the world. And I'm talking about our responsibility, our part of this. And with that, I want to introduce the National Cybersecurity Policy, because it's an important document that we wrote in 2017 in Chile. We are a very early country that's part of cybersecurity, actually, and the conscience about it, the big problem, but and the implication of cybersecurity. Our policy, it's not just for trade, it's not just for a sector specifically, it's for the people and in general for the country. And we want a free, open, secure, and resilient cyberspace. The last word is very important in our case, because resilience is a concept that we use historically in our country. We have a lot of earthquakes, so we need to rebuild everything from zero when we have this big hits. And so this is part of our culture, and we think this is very important and a key issue when we're talking about cybersecurity, because at some point cybersecurity can get you down if you have a business, and you need to stop that, and you need to take measures to rebuild your business and create confidence with the rest of the economy. Our key issues in our cyber policy says in 5 different points. We want a robust and resilient infrastructure for the country, and that's mean for every aspect of the state, and actually also for the private sector. We are encouraged the private sector to be part of this policy, even when it's not mandatory, because it's not a legal frame. But we want a robust and resilient infrastructure, and especially in critical infrastructure. Also, we want to safeguard the rights of the people in cyberspace and do a lot of awareness campaigns. It's critical for our country because we are really new in this, to get into not just the citizens, also in the private sector, to encourage them to put attention in what could be the cost of not apply cybersecurity and their employees and then in the main infrastructure. And also we are looking for cooperation, international cooperation, in many aspects. In this aspect specifically is to talk about the different models in different countries. We understand commerce is a big issue too, but we are talking about in the state levels right now. We share information we share strategies too, and to deal with the malware. That's specifically in the big threat here. The malware and any other kind of risk. I'm going to show you a slide about that. And also we work with the private sector because we need to create a development of cybersecurity in the industry. In the first part, we are talking about create a legal framework, a cybersecurity law, a critical infrastructure standard, a standard for software that we buy or that we create. And about the safeguard for the people, we're talking about create a cybercrime law, personal data law. That's very important. And we are looking for what are doing the rest of the country, especially to try to take the model, for example, from Europe. And about that, and to join to the rest of the country. We know we are far from them in many areas, so we are working on that. Also, well, this is critical for us: awareness campaigns, good practices, and national survey. We need to know what is our state in this matter. Because we are sometimes in some areas we don't know anything about what is the aspect of the industry or in the state. So we're in a very early stage. And international cooperation, to take any chance to get involved in discussions like today, for example, is something that it's critical for us to understand different points of view. For example, today it's I'm here to defend the cybersecurity role, and maybe somebody else could say, okay, but this is if you impose some rules, this is going to be against the commerce. Okay, but I'm dealing in this moment. I just looking for the main problem here is we need to deal with the malware or the threat in general, the risk. And well, in industry and development, we are looking for to be a state sponsorship of different projects, analyze public sector procurement regime, and want to introduce we are working with them. We are creative many helping working with the private sector to create the cybersecurity consciousness inside the industry without imposing the rules yet, because we don't have as I said before, the legal framework yet. And why it's important that my perspective may be here, because we are learning about cybersecurity from this kind of milestones. And after every attack, we understand what's important of cybersecurity. In 2018, one year and a half from after our policy was written, even when the policy was written, it wasn't the CSIRT, my team, or our national CERT. But in 2018, when this attack hit one of the two biggest banks of Chile, actually the name of it is Bank of Chile, we understood the problem is a real thing. And private sector and public sector invest in create the CSIRT. Then in 2019, we helped to recover the system after a big emotive attack. And in 2019, we have this very national thing, an outbreak, and we discovered another threat as hacktivism, and then in part that is it's hit a lot of governmental infrastructure about the reliability of the state. And then we have COVID. COVID is start a new kind of threat in general, not just in public, also in industry and commerce, because we now understand that the vulnerability problems in many aspects and when workers work remotely, for example, they don't have the minimal protection in their PC. this is like more or less that everybody is saying, that so we have a threat and risk in the first part, but I want to take more attention for vulnerabilities and because we understand what is the cost in industry and public sector when you don't have a patch. Every second Tuesday of every month, Microsoft, for example, gave a big warning about what you need to do with your patch. You need to patch. You need to patch. You think could be a problem, but actually it's a very important thing that you need to do. It's not just for the businesses, for the state, for the citizens, for everybody. And that could help a lot against the other kind of risks and threats to help your business actually. Well, this is like it's like about what our biggest threat and I said before, when you don't patch, you will put in risk a lot of your operation. And consciousness is not here, but it's also critical in this aspect. So we have this strategy to be.
What was the first one, Patricio? What was the first risk?
Yes, we don't patch. It says vulnerabilities. Well, the information gathering is very important and critical because when you're looking for information from another enterprise, it could be, for example, for espionage or I don't know. And malicious code, I'm talking about. Do you know what is critical for business? Fraud, the fourth one, because we have a lot of false false websites, for example, that are using the name of the company to get to you. No, it's not a threat to you. It's a threat for your it's a threat for your brand, for your even for your safety, because sometimes it's taking your name for false things, and everybody's down with this. It's sometimes companies don't look at this because they think it's okay. I have my web page, and somebody else can create the same web page and change just a letter, and it started to attack to your business, your clients. And we're encouraged in the institution that you'd be very aware about this. We are creating tools for help the private sector to realize what is important about to get to the court and asking to the institution for to fight against the fraudsters to take down the false web page, for example. Well, this in general what does CISR start doing. I'm not going to take more time of you, but we work with the private sector, and we understand that the real key thing in our country is not just to make a rate this policy, is actually to get to this to a legal frame is critical, and also to encourage that it's important, really important, even it could be expensive, but it's really important to put attention in what the regulator said. It's critical for the cybersecurity environment in general. So that can I share now? I'm going to stop to share.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Patricio. I think that was a good overview of all the different dimensions that your policy is trying to cover, and which I'm sure often pull in different directions: the robust and resilient infrastructure objective, the education of the public generally, the ambition to protect rights of people in cyberspace, and also development of the private sector. On that last note, do let me turn to the private sector. Let me turn to Andre first at this point. Speaking about the development of cybersecurity policies in your particular sector, what can you tell us about the policies developed in your sector and their trade implications from your business perspective?
Hello once more. Let me share screen again. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Good. So this is where we stopped last time. Before we proceed to how to say subject which mentioned Wolf, I would like to share some statistic data with regards to cybercrime. And to present it to you, it was taken from various reports, but I have taken the most interesting for us as a private company from financial services sector. So we see that more than 24,000 malicious applications are automatically blocked by application markets. That is to say, people are trying to publish on the official markets malicious applications, and there are billions of those applications to be published, and of course it cannot be checked by human, and all these check routines are automated, and those attackers try and have hope to hack this check routine and get the malicious applications officially published. On a global level, cyber attack happens every 39 seconds. Yeah, this is also very prominent, how to say, figure, meaning that until we are having this conversation, many companies were already attempted to attack. 60% of the small companies are out of business after major cyber attack. This is because according to certain reports, the average cost of cyber attack is $1.3 million US. So of course, not every company, especially small, are able to cover this cost and to continue their business. Next one is also very important. There are more than 110 billion lines of new software code being produced each year, which means that new features are widely developed, but this also means that new vulnerabilities, new potential vulnerabilities, or unexpected behavior is also produced and presented to the wide audience. And as a previous speaker mentioned, Microsoft is issuing security patches on regular basis, and this is not because they do their job bad, it's just ongoing process, and we will never stop in doing this. Next one are also very important for our business. Average time to identify a breach in last year was more than 200 days, which means that for 200 days company was operating and not knowing that its systems were already compromised, and attackers was collecting, harvesting data, and they are vulnerable now. And average life cycle of a breach was more than 300 days. A life cycle means from breach introduction to the systems of the company and to the breach containment, which means that, for example, from this example, we see that more than 100 days need every company, once they know that they got a breach, to identify where the breach happened and to apply remediation measures. According to official annual cybercrime report, worldwide cybercrimes will cost to world economy more than 6 trillion of United States dollars. Very, how to say, drastic figures, and very big impact on overall economy. Now let's move to previous one slide, and I will explain what we are either faced in the past or continue facing on regular basis with those threats. Here they are. So,
Henry, sorry to interrupt. Are you going to focus on the policy soon? It would be good, in light of the time, if you can get to the policy part, that would be useful. So apologies for interrupting.
No problem at all. Regarding policies, let me we as a financial institution needs to abide by certain standards. First of all is payment card industry security standard, PCI DSS. We are in terms of policy, it was also as a very good example of how international standards probably should be developed, because from historical point of view, every big card scheme was trying to implement its own security standard in late 90s. For example, in the 1999, Visa made first attempt at creating security standard with their cardholder information security program. Visa struggled with compliance from merchants because of the differences between North America and international security guidelines. They were not alone. MasterCard, American Express, Discover, JCB tried and also failed with their own standards. And at the end, those brands came to conclusions that they need to establish, how to say, over-the-top body where they will delegate their representatives, and they will establish the rules which will be accepted as mandatory ones by all players in this market. And this is how Payment Card Industry Standard Security Council has appeared. In terms of policy also, I wanted to share and to express my thoughts that, for example, unfortunately, even though we have all those figures about cyber crimes increasing in volumes, many companies are increasing their IT budgets, etc., etc., etc. Many people still have a perception that those policies are formal ones, and this is just an obstacle for them to run a business. And in this case, they just prefer to be formally, how to say, meet the requirements, but don't implement it in real life. And this is the biggest issue with regards to policies, I would say, because as again, one of the previous speaker mentioned, we can provide the best policies for many pages, but the weak point is when it comes to enforcement of those policies, security guidelines, etc. And how it can be, how to say, overcome only through awareness, and we need to invest in education of people who are occupying leading positions in IT sector, because unfortunately, right now, cybersecurity relates more directly to IT sector, to IT department of companies, and to IT employees. And we need, I would say that we need to take this example from, for example, how PCI Standard Security Council was established, probably for world standards in the area of cybersecurity. For example, right now, we know that in Europe, there is initiative to have one security framework across all member states. We have agency for network and information security, and probably we need to think one step in advance and start attracting international, how to say, similar bodies or authorities in order to develop world level of standards of the security from LATAM countries, from America, from Asia, from Africa, etc. Yeah. Wolf, I'm sorry, we cannot hear you. You have muted your microphone.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you particularly for these experiences and the call for and illustrating the need for a superior body to formulate cross-cutting policies that can apply to different players in a field. Let me briefly give the floor to Zane also to share his experiences from his perspective before I hand it over to the ITU colleagues to round up this round on national policies development and their perspectives on international trade. Zane.
Thank you, Wolf. I hope I'm a little clearer than before. Can everybody hear me clearer? So maybe some key considerations out of experience when South Africa started drafting the national security framework or national cybersecurity framework that normally lacks on a country basis, in my opinion. So one of them, for instance, is the failure to fully comprehend or understand the cybersecurity basics. I think that's a major one, and that goes all the way from the schooling structure right up to executive level in the country, where it's a problem understanding or covering the cybersecurity basics. Number two, I'd say, is the lack of the understanding of the corporate cybersecurity risks. It's actually what not just the country face, but what the respective sectors face. And the one short on its heels, it's fully understanding and comprehending the financial impact and the economic impact. I'm tempted to say that if this was fully comprehended, not just on the international level, but in a local level as well, and even on a company or corporate level, you would have a lot more, adequate cyber resilience and cyber responses. One of my colleagues earlier referred to the fact that, the amount of companies that resurges after major cybersecurity attack, whether ransomware, whether it is a, Trojanware, or whatever the case may be. It's frightening how many more companies goes under purely because the lack of financial and economic understanding is, whether it's local or international, is not thoroughly understood. Then also there's the one major one in my opinion, which is the confusion between compliance versus actual cybersecurity responses, or the standards set versus the cybersecurity response, not just on the country level, but on the international level as well. And more often than not, this directly translating into companies ticking the boxes and not actually are prepared for any form of attack, purely because they just go through the mundane task of what they need to comply with. And this goes across industries. I myself find myself in the defense and security industry, and we often see that companies just say, I comply, but guess what? They forgot that there's an actioning part to it as well. And I see that compliance part is actioning as well in terms of creating a
Zane, apologies for cutting in. I'm afraid we're losing your sound to an extent that it is no longer audible. I've caught something at the beginning, and I think you pointed out a theme similar to what had previously been mentioned, that the understanding of the cyber dimension and the impact and an awareness of the impact of cyber incidents was one of the biggest problems I think you described in developing a policy. Can I kindly and please ask for your understanding if we ask you to either change your microphone or try and improve the technical context, because it is really virtually inaudible now, what you're saying.
Is this going better?
It's much
yes, this is better. Yes.
Okay, super.
Yeah.
So apologies for that sound earlier on, guys. So as I was saying, just latching on to my previous statement, and maybe just recapping, I said the failure to understand cyber basics, I think it's one of the fundamentals. I went on by saying also the understanding of the corporate cybersecurity risks that actually faces businesses, but also a country. I think that forms part of the inadequacy in drafting policy. Understanding when it comes to the economic impact, but also the financial impact when it comes to businesses, and economic impact both on a micro as well as a macro level. I think that is one of the greatest things, because the quantification of the losses suffered during any form of cyber attack is yet to be known to all of us. The problem is the recording thereof and obviously the sharing of that information. part and parcel because it's embarrassing to some institutions, but also because that has share value if companies are listed. Then there's also the confusion between the compliance, as I said, and cyber security. The compliance part is ticking the boxes, whereas it is actually being prepared for any form of cyber attack and the resilience thereof in order to research after such attack. I also refer to the fact that, you know, there's weak links, for instance, in that affecting trade that doesn't come to the fore when a cyber policy has been drafted, and that deals with the fact that there's a great lack of information sharing, not just interagency information sharing, but also sectorial information sharing, and that creates a huge void in drafting such policies. Also, nowadays we have, I mean, for the last, I would say probably a better part of 10 or so years, we've got the Boyd policy, which is bring your own device. And this is not just on a company or a business level, but also on a national level, where the lack of comprehension, understanding what this actually means, understanding what it means for policy when looking at you know, corporate espionage, looking at industrial espionage, and countering intelligence and intelligence leaks when it comes to the creation of a bring your own device policy within a national cyber security framework. Then there is issues of funding, you know, the training part of it, resource planning and management, education, the industry collaborations. I spoke about it earlier on as well. And then there's things like recovery planning. And what makes cyber or a national cybersecurity framework a little bit trickier than your traditional, you know, frameworks being drafted either by a government or an organization, and specifically within the South African context, is the fact that this is an evolving space. I mean, we heard cyber attacks happening every 39 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. There is known to us, I think, close to 117 new viruses created, I think, every day. That is known to us. So you're dealing with an asymmetrical warfare type, if I might say, use that term, the defense term. And the problem is the lack of understanding of these, you know, basic concepts I just gave you now, and incorporating this in a national security or national cybersecurity framework does create a void between trade in the first place, business as a whole, but also nationally when it comes to creating such framework. Again, we were led by information sharing, but also the privacy aspects. And we were also led by the fact that there is great security concerns with regards to this, but also the aspects of having the ability to comply with international standards. I'm sure we're going to go to the Q&As because I saw some interesting questions raised by some of the attendees in relation to ICAO and its regulations.
Yes, yes, thank you, Zane. Yes, indeed. I think that reinforces the challenges that were already raised by Patricio, the multidimensional aspects of formulating policy in this area, and the fact that it is, of course, indeed evolving. Let's now turn to our ITU colleagues who I think have done quite some work on trying to get a handle on this evolving area by surveying quite a number of national cybersecurity policies. I'll turn it over to them in the interest of time to be concise and tell us what you found.
Thank you, Wolf. So looking at policies at the global view and how we at the ITU look into member states' commitment to cybersecurity, first and foremost, from the legal view, we see that more and more countries are adopting cybersecurity-related laws and regulations, often broad and spanning multiple sectors. This can address cybercrime, critical infrastructure, data protection, digital signature, among other cybersecurity areas. Looking just at cybercrime alone, we have seen an increase in countries reporting that they have a cybercrime law enforced, with 91% responding yes in 2018. Many of these have modeled their laws based on the Budapest Convention of 2001. We see that countries are also using the recent GDPR to strengthen their data protection acts, especially the Europe region, have adapted to the use of GDPR. The graph here also shows that in 2017 and 2018, 67% of countries had some sort of a data protection act. As also disclosed through the GCI, 107 countries have national strategies on cybersecurity. However, trade elements have not been a topic that is clearly added to these strategies. And yet strategies can impact trade through the regulation of encryption and digital technologies, the ease of e-commerce, and the storage and flow of data across borders. But current strategies address trade in different ways. For instance, the United States strategy frequently mentions trade and commerce, while the British strategy only addresses it briefly. The Rwandan strategy, however, goes a little bit deep on strategy on trade and cybersecurity. But this doesn't imply that one country's policy is better than the other. For example, in the GCI 2018, UK had the highest score, but this doesn't mean that UK's policy is better than others. Most countries adopt these strategies according to their national needs. Now, looking at the technical point of view, the technical measures look at whether there are specific mechanisms to address cybersecurity from the state level. National StarSats have been known for coordinating and supporting responses to computer events or incident responses at the national level. Some countries, in addition to the national SATs, have sectorial SATs, and most of these sectorial SATs are only in the financial sectors and academia. The graph here also shows that 109 countries have national SATs, while only 42 countries have sectorial SATs, according to the data collected in 2018. So thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. So this was a good overview of a bird's eye view of what different countries have done, and we can see that there is a focus on cybercrime and on data protection, which would correspond also to what is, of course, most salient in the public discussion. I want to open it up for a quick round of questions here, but very quick with an eye on the time, because I do want to have a last intervention on ICT before we close. So I think there was a question to you, Heidi, regarding the TBT reference that you made. I don't know whether you want to address that, or whether any of the panelists would like to comment on anything that your co-panelists have said.
Well, I got the question on TBT and whether the trade policy framework can deal, let's say, with those barriers, if I understood it correctly. And that's a really complicated question, because those barriers that we have seen on the trade policy arena is based that those regulatory measures that are taken are motivated by national security, which is a legitimate objective and also a quite critical issue to address within the WTO. And my response was also, well, how to deal then with cyber regulation. First of all, I think that we should work towards international effective solutions. I mean, a better regulation, but also, let's say, those findings that I have show that when you are focusing on regulatory measures very late in the product life cycle, it becomes already too late. So built-in security is also a question. But for me, of course, as an economist, I don't know how to do it, but as an answer, how this could be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me open the floor to the other panelists and maybe throw in one of the questions that we received prior to the seminar, which was, I think, gives everybody a chance to respond. The question is, we always talk about best practices. What are the worst practices in cybersecurity policy from national governments or IGOs? So I'll ask everyone to have a 1-minute response to this, if possible, from your perspective and from your sector. And I'll start with Andre, if that's all right. What's the worst practices in cybersecurity policy from a national government or an IGO?
Yes, thank you. Right now, I cannot answer to this directly. I mean, because we are open to regulation of certain governing bodies and Spanish legislation, and I wouldn't say that there are some worst practices, so I don't have information to compare with. But I would answer from another point that I would say that the worst practices from the companies who are meant to be compliant to those policies is to do this certification or compliance from the formal perspective. Again, I would raise this point once because this poses huge security risk, really, because in conversation from different companies which we've got during various market events, etc., many of them unfortunately still accepts all these regulations as an obstacle to do business. They think that they know how to do security, they know how to do all other things, and until they got, attacked, got hacked, they will not have serious perception of those policies which they have to be abide.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So business attitude is the biggest problem. I'll go to Patricio, who will probably have something to say about this. 1 minute. What's the worst practice in cybersecurity policy?
Well, I'm going to say two. The biggest one is to say or think that you're never going to hit by an attack. You feel like invisible and invincible. It's a wrong policy because sometimes big companies think that they have a lot of tools, or maybe they have they hired the experts, or maybe they buy the systems and they feel just ready with that, and not to do, for example, consciousness. You need to think about your enterprise, your business as a big network. Everybody who is part of the business could be an open door for an attack. So you need to be attentive in every aspect of the cybersecurity, and you need to feel that you could be a threat, because even if you are the biggest one in this game or the smallest, you can be a victim. That's a general aspect that was the worst part, not to be attentive of that. And then a very specific one, what I said before, patch. Please patch every of your tools, web page, your systems. You need to be attentive also to patch when they release the information.
Thank you. So that is, well, more a private practice, I think. Let me quickly go to our ITU colleagues to say something in this regard. What are the worst practices in cybersecurity?
Well, ultimately, Wolf, and this is, I don't mean this as a cop-out, but ultimately the worst practices are the ones that increase cyber risk and don't help with cybersecurity. That will really depend on individual countries. So it's hard to say that one is universally bad, universally good. I will say, however, I think the points that our previous panelists have made are right on, that this is a continuous process that you need to continue to engage in, and it's not a one and done. So engaging with the wider ecosystem, because ultimately cyber vulnerabilities can cross borders. They're not going to be limited to one specific place, one specific device.
All right, thank you very much. Zain, you have a minute.
My minute, I think it's lots and lots of policies, but zero implementation. I think that speaks for itself. You've got piles and piles of paper with no implementation. That essentially, renders whatever you wanted or your intention was null. Second one, the exclusion of private sector when you start considering things like this, because if you cannot quantify, it's not just a steering mechanism, but it's also a mechanism of getting people involved in collaborating when you formulate, not just a sound policy, but also sound practices. And then Thirdly, in my opinion, is the lack of information sharing. Everybody again just doing their own thing, and for various reasons. And then fourthly, some bad practices is, if you look at some coding systems and I'm talking a South African concept, a kid gets taught how to code from grade 1, for instance, but there's no built-in cybersecurity education when it comes to this. And this is the only way you have the ability to create cyber armies in order to become more cyber aware, nation and citizens.
Thank you very much. Now, we have 4.5 minutes left. We've already talked about a little bit about the third question that we wanted to cover. I think both Andri, but also Heidi have spoken about the regulation in the ICT area, standards development and product regulation. I want to give each of them 2 more minutes to round off what they wanted to say in this regard, and then our ITU colleagues to have a quick final word on this before we close this very interesting and broad webinar that we've had. So Heidi, 2 minutes, if I may ask you.
Thank you so much. Let's see here if I manage. Maybe not, I won't use more time for this. Let's start by actually answering your earlier question. What is the worst case that authorities can do? Something that I think that we really need to understand is that what different authorities or even different countries see as valuable information assets are different from country to country and from sector to sector, but also the capabilities to protect these information assets are different from country to country, which actually explains the difficulty in harmonizing requirements. And the worst thing you can do is actually introduce expensive regulatory measures that don't actually deliver then security. But there are some issues that I think that you could follow further on. One is the privatization of critical infrastructure services. State knows less and less, but much happens in the private sector. So private-public partnerships are really important. Also, privatization of regulation. As we probably know, in this kind of fast-moving technological scene, companies are far ahead of authorities. So we should really, if we want to know what's happening, we should follow standardization, what is happening. And then also then think what kind of cybersecurity requirements to lean on, as we know also some vulnerabilities or problems in some of the tools that we actually have today to address this issue. So I think that I stop here, but I also invite you all to, I have only scratched on the surface, to maybe study our analyses to find even more answers on this topic. Thank you so much.
Indeed, thank you very much. Over to you, Andri. What else would you like to share with us on the ICT product regulation standards development as an illustration of cybersecurity policy?
Yes, thank you. Again, as it was mentioned earlier, it's quite hard to elaborate the standard cybersecurity policy, which would be applicable for all trade applications around the world. And for example, again, payment card industry data security standard is one example of solving particular problem, how to properly deal with credit card data. And also, if you remember one of my previous slides, when I showed that after how to say data breach and compromise of IT systems of the company could pass more than 200 days until it's opened, that the system is actually compromised, and it takes more than 100 days again to rectify and to address the issue. And here I would probably promote one idea that in a case of vast majority and huge variety of possible implementation, architectural design of various systems, probably we may facilitate this investigation phase. And I mean, when it's known that some IT systems are being compromised, and try to address this issue as soon as possible. And I think that we can achieve this if we will standardize the log collection policy for all around system, because log collection is a separate process which can be considered and standardized as a, how to say, separate entity, irrespective of how complicated the actual architecture is and what the service is. Because all the post-forensic investigation, all investigation internal is done based on the analyzing what's happened in the system. So it started to be harmful for data, for users, for privacy. So
thank you. Yes.
For this, yeah.
Thank you, Eduardo, for these concrete suggestions as well. Where we are and where we can go is with regard to ICT regulation and standardization. Let me give the floor to Caroline for a 1-minute bird's eye overview from the policy development level. And then we will, I'm afraid, have to close this webinar, as I think one of our panelists also has to leave very soon. Caroline?
Thank you. Just have to unmute myself there. Thank you. So this has been a really great discussion. We're really happy to have been part of it. I think one of the big takeaways from us is trade is enabled by interoperability and trust. And standards, as have been brought up, are a way to establish that interoperability and trust when applied well. We have seen from our high-level view an increase in the number of standards. Specifically, a lot of countries are either developing their own or they're adopting these international standards, ISO 27000 or NIST. If we look really closely at cooperation, we can see that countries are also more engaged in different types of cooperation, multilateral agreements, bilateral agreements. And we also see this in the private-public partnership. So we're encouraged to see that. It's been mentioned by other panelists, this kind of cooperation is important so that we can properly address what's going on. So Grace, do you want to comment on this? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself there. So what I would say on one of the best practices maybe is we would say it would be good that we involve the stakeholder in the process, meaning cooperation and information sharing to ease security in a coordinated and in an organic way, because resilience means that all critical sectors have a minimum level of security, because a chain is as stronger as its weakest link. That's all for myself.
Yes, and to add on to that, security needs to be proactive, not just reactive in this situation. We're working on a number of different ways of building or developing capacity in countries, but this is an ongoing process for everybody. Thank you both.
Thank you very much. I think this is the time. We're already over the end of the allotted time. Thank you everyone for participating. I think we've had a good tour d'horizon of the landscape on cybersecurity. We've tried the impossible, bridging all the way from understanding what the risks are to policy responses and their implications for trade. I've certainly learned a lot. I think we've had a good illustration of the dimension of the problem and the financial impact of the problem with the data from Mandri in the financial sector, but also Zane and others, how substantial that risk actually is. But at the same time, we've heard about the lack of awareness and reaction and the willingness of actors to engage in policy formulation. So that points to the fact that we're still at the very beginning of a comprehensive reaction. We've had a good overview of how policy is formulated. I learned the Chilean perspective was very helpful in that regard, the different objectives that the policy formulation has to take into account and how they may, at certain points, conflict. And then we've looked at the details of policy formulation between product standardization that already had, of course, developed in a patchwork kind of sense, and the pros and cons, including questions about its efficiency in the cyber context, moving to infrastructure certification, and the challenges or advantages that that may bring in reacting to an ever-changing situation rather than sticking with individual products, while this was not meant to make the former superfluous, of course. I think we've highlighted the trade dimension, not only with regard to global value chains and digital value chains. Just from the Chilean perspective, we know that one of the central ingredients of vaccines is actually exported from Chile, so we don't want, and it's one of the few sources of this particular product, so we don't want the value chains from Chile to be under threat. And I hope Patricio, who has had to leave us, I think, or is he still here, will continue to be supported in his endeavors to ensure that. We've closed, I think, with a couple of very concrete suggestions in the ICT sector from the financial sector, which I thought was enlightening. And I'm certain that this will not be the last time that we've spoken about this particular topic. Let me close by inviting you to tune in again tomorrow when the next webinar will be held. I think it will be at the same time. Then focusing on the multilateral and regional approaches to cybersecurity. So some of the themes I'm sure will be revisited then, and focus on another aspect, a subset, namely on cross-border exchange of information for law enforcement or regulatory oversight purposes. Some of that I think will probably hark back to what we've said today. Let me close here. We're already over time. Thank you to ERSD for putting this on, and thank you for all to all the panelists who have made this an exciting and broad discussion, and to everybody who participated, which made the chat, I think, an equally exciting place to be during this discussion. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.